Yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about Bucky and Buckminster Fuller and how a number of his ideas share some of the same concerns of general semantics and Alfred Korzybski. So I'll highlight some of these connections. First, I guess just a brief introduction of who Bucky is in case people don't know. He was born in 1895, died in 1983, and just this past July would have been his 125th birthday. If you know Bucky at all, you may know him for his geodesic domes, which he popularized. Another of his famous designs was a remarkable three-wheeled car that could carry 11 passengers. It's called the Dymaxion car. Had a top speed of 120 miles an hour and could make incredibly tight U-turns. Over his long creative life, he had many more designs and became the holder of 28 patents. He also held 47 honorary degrees and wrote 28 books and gave countless of hours of lectures. Several of these long, rambling talks, always delivered without notes, are available on YouTube. Most famous, perhaps, is his 42-hour lecture series titled Everything I Know, delivered in 1975. Bucky has been called an inventor, a guru, a poet, a genius, and many other things besides. No single label suffices. And here we have our first joint concern with general semantics. Bucky himself resisted labels and was suspicious of them, much as any good practitioner of general semantics would be. When people tried to pin a label on him, he deflected it and often referred to himself as a bundle of experience or a perfectly average human being. Bucky tried to fight what he called categoryitis, the tendency to put people and things and ideas in little boxes that make them easier to handle, but that also limit how we think about these people and things and ideas. In this, Bucky sounds warnings that could have come from Korzybski himself. Bucky and Korzybski met several times. According to Bucky's telling, the first time was in Chicago in 1928. Bucky described their relationship in an interview with Harold Drake from Auburn University. Quote, "We were really two ships and we made contact in the great ocean and found that we had the same navigational instruments and felt camaraderie." Bucky wound up giving seminars at Korzybski's Institute of General Semantics and even delivered the 1955 Korzybski Memorial Lecture. And Bucky cited Korzybski in his magnum opus, Synergetics. As I mentioned earlier, Bucky shared with Korzybski and general semantics generally a thoughtful use of labels and categories. I'd like to give you a couple examples of this. In an interview with Anwar Dill is talking glowingly about Einstein, and he uses words such as artist and scientist and poet to describe Einstein. And then Dill asks Bucky what he thinks. And Fuller responds, "I would say the word scientist, the word artist, and the word poet are invented by humans." I love that response because it makes clear that meanings do not inhere in words themselves, but are subject to interpretation, another core insight of general semantics. Bucky seems unwilling to engage in the usual pointless debate about what somebody is using vague labels. Bucky, by the way, deeply admired Einstein. Calling out words in this way was a common tactic Bucky would use in interviews. I'll share one more example from an interview with Martin Pauly, included in Pauly's 1990 book on Bucky. And Pauly basically calls Bucky a failure because his inventions did not become more commercially successful. And Bucky replied, quote, "Failure is a word invented by men. There is no such thing as failure in nature," unquote. More than just wordplay, Bucky's way of speaking reflected a way of looking at the world, as explored in great depth in his Synergetics books, which are about more than just geometry. They're about pattern and structure, in particular as found in nature. I think Korzybski would have been sympathetic to his efforts. For example, Bucky was skeptical of mathematical conventions such as pi with its infinite series. Nature isn't using pi, Bucky thought. And as Amy Edmondson put it, she used to work for Bucky and she wrote an excellent book about synergetics. She said, "Irrational numbers don't belong in tangible experiences." Instead, Bucky preferred working with hands-on models and relying on experience. In the same way, Korzybski reminded us that 1 + 1 does not always equal 2 in the, quote, real world, unquote. Korzybski showed the non-additive nature of experience by pointing out, among other examples, that 1 gallon of water plus 1 gallon of alcohol does not make for 2 gallons of liquid, but something less. In a similar way, Bucky liked to say there really is no up or down. We are standing on Earth, and the Earth is is a spinning globe. Up is only relative to where you are standing at that moment. Things can fly in toward Earth or out or around, but there is no up or down in the universe. Likewise, Bucky chafed at the words sunset and sunrise. The sun didn't go down every night, nor did it rise in the morning. It was the Earth that moved around the sun, not the sun around the Earth. He suggested the terms sun clips and sunsight as more accurate, though those words never caught on. You will find Bucky connecting experiences and language in this way throughout his works and talks. It's part of Bucky's synergetic worldview. Everything has its role, everything is connected to everything else, which is akin to Korzybski's organism as a whole and its environment. As Bucky says, nature doesn't have separate departments for math, chemistry, biology, physics, etc. It's all one regenerative process. Perhaps because of this aiming at precision, he could overdo it, and the result could be that his prose could be hard to read. Bucky Speak is what we call it. Bucky Speak has to be experienced to be believed. I'll give you a typically armored passage from Ideas and Integrities. Includes this following, quote, within the plurality of progressively harvested physical principles of experience, which could be converted through initiative to articulable advantages, thus in turn progressively modifying man's a priori physical environmental hazard patterns and thereby bettering his effective survival chances. Translating that takes some doing. Or maybe he just had an impish sense of humor. There was a particularly rhapsodic passage in 9 Chains to the Moon where Bucky Speak blooms in a description of the human body, describing it as a self-balancing 28-jointed adapter-based biped. Our hands and arms are crushers and cranes with self-surfacing and lubricating systems and a universally distributed telephone system needing no service for 70 years if well maintained. You can practically see the wink and the smile. Bucky also wrote a kind of poetry called ventilated prose, and depending on your sensibilities, his poetry will either delight you or horrify you. Here's an example. Converting 100 tons of raw broad countryside into 5 tons of scintillating airplane in flight. For Bucky, countrysides imply or contain aircraft in the same way a block of marble contains a statue. In this sense, we never create or invent anything, we only discover. And that is the way Bucky usually liked to talk about the process of turning raw materials into cinder blocks and monkey wrenches in pickup trucks. So Bucky didn't quite have the gift of saying things simply, or rather he didn't exercise it as much as he might have, but I think he was aware of what he was doing. Calvin Tompkins tells a funny story in a 1966 New Yorker essay titled In the Outlaw Area. Quote, students dig Bucky's humor, which often appears as a sort of wry comment on his own verbal style, as for example, when digressing to students at the University of London about bird ecology not long ago. He described how, quote, the male birds fly off to sweep out areas of maximum anticipated metabolic advantage, unquote, and then paused and added reflexively, worms. Hugh Kenner writes that in creating his own jargon and phrasings to discuss the universe, Bucky escapes a shared idiom's liabilities. These simplicities of example were Lincoln-esque in Kenner's terms. Everything is all part of a finely woven fabric called universe. This way of thinking entails a new reading of the human story, Kenner writes, not disowning nor discrediting what we experience, but rendering it all continuous. Well, that's a sweet sounding way to make Bucky's contortions sound beautiful. In Bucky Speak, architects become shelter tailors, cattle and plants become knots of energy, the earth becomes a spaceship, and we're all astronauts. And though Bucky didn't invent the phrase Spaceship Earth, it became a popular metaphor in his talks and books. It's his starting point for orienting himself in the universe. The sun is like a power plant, an energy supply ship 92 miles away. It takes 8 minutes for the sun's rays to reach the earth. Thus, the universe is, quote, non-simultaneously apprehended, as Bucky liked to say. It doesn't happen all at once in any sense we can detect. There are stars we see in the sky that happened millions of years ago and probably burnt out long ago. But think about what this implies about our existence. It means questions such as how big is the universe, or how old is the universe? What lies outside of the universe become meaningless. The underlying assumption of these questions is that the universe is something static, which happens at once and that you can get a hold of. Bucky liked to keep in mind this physical map of our planet and solar system and galaxy. It seeped into all his thinking. For example, a person's age reflects so many trips around the sun. That's how Bucky thought about it. Years, too, are Earth-based phenomenon. On Mars, it takes 687 Earth days to complete an orbit around the sun, a Martian year, you might say. For Venus, it takes just 225 days, and Jupiter, 12 years. So, Bucky always tried to bring his audience closer to real-world structures and away from theoretical ones. This is another way in which Bucky's and Krzysztof's projects are similar. What Edmondson again says about Bucky applies equally to Krzysztof, I think. Quote, Fuller felt that society did not sufficiently emphasize this discrepancy between theoretical games and real structures. In other words, the map is not the territory. For example, in the real world, there are no straight lines, only vectors of a definite length and direction. There are no perfect spheres or smooth surfaces or 90-degree angles. These idealized forms from geometry are not found in nature. Likewise, there are no true solids, because even in the atoms that make up marble, the electrons can be as remote from each other to scale as the Earth from the moon. Solid objects are full of space. Place is an average because everything is in motion. There are no things, only events. The universe has no nouns, only verbs. The universe itself is a scenario. It is non-simultaneously apprehended, if it is apprehended at all. Which brings us to the idea of a tunable range of human experience. There is a whole swirl of events going on around us that we miss. Bucky had a visible way to express this idea. He called it the omnidirectional halo. I won't describe this whole thing entirely, but it looks like that. So you got that visual map of it. It just means he has events that span the concentric rings of this model from the outermost, which are irrelevant because they're too large and too infrequent, to the innermost, which is also irrelevant because they're too small and too frequent. And inside these rings lies the narrow band of lucidly relevant events, the tunable range, as he called it. And for me, it's a model that reminds us of our limitations of our awareness, but for me, it also evokes Krzysztof's structural differential. Of course, there's a lot more I could say, and there's a lot more to Bucky's thought than what I've hinted at here, and more connections I could have drawn. But I hope I've shown enough for you to see how Bucky's thinking shared many of the same concerns as general semantics. For both, the map is most certainly not the territory. Thank you.